I've been asked to cover the first 2 decades of the 20th century in half an hour, which is a tall order because it was a very crowded and controversial period of labour history. For socialists, it was a time of great hope. They were convinced that capitalism was doomed by its contradictions and the 20th century was going to be their century. And that view seemed to be underpinned by major industrial unrest, throughout the industrial world, which would have been most of Europe, North America, bits of Australia, South America at that time. But you had a growing number of general and generalised strikes with violence, the use of police and troops against strikers, and all that seemed to be kind of confirming the idea that capitalism was, moving towards a terminal crisis. In fact, some people argue that, had it not been for the World War, that England would have faced a major industrial crisis, if not perhaps even a social revolution in 1914. And then the war, because it was an industrial war, strengthened organised labour. And by 1917, certainly in the wake of the Russian Revolution, there was this feeling that the ruling class, the ruling elites, were discredited by the war. They had blundered into this catastrophic event. And the future after the war was going to be different. It was going to be a new age of the people, socialism, democracy, the people, trade unions, all these things were going to be a lot more important after the war. So these trends found full expression in Ireland, and this age of agitation included perhaps the 2 most famous disputes in Irish, industrial disputes in Irish history, the Belfast strike, dock strike of 1907 and the 1913 lockout in Dublin, and produced the 3 most disputed leaders of Irish labour in William Walker, Big Jim Larkin and James Connolly. And one of the things that made them disputed was their differing views on the 2 big questions facing labour, which were, first of all, how to develop a political movement. Should labour support the British Labour Party or support the Irish Nationalist Party or form a separate Irish Labour Party? And then how did you develop the trade union movement? How could you build an effective trade union movement for the massive workers in a country where employers were completely hostile to the unionisation of unskilled workers? And the one major centre of industry was here in Belfast. And both of these questions were bound up with the national question, because the trade union question too, because it raised the issue of whether to stick with the British unions or to form separate Irish trade unions. But first of all, let me look at the position of labour. According to the 1911 census, there were about 900,000 employees, almost 350,000 agricultural or general labourers, 170,000 in domestic or related service, just over 200,000 in textiles and clothing, and it's mainly women, of course, in domestic service and textiles and clothing. Over 30,000 in shipbuilding and engineering, mainly in Belfast, almost 50,000 in construction or building. And so you had about 7 out of every 9 employees in largely unskilled and low-paid employment, and largely unorganised employment. There were only about 70,000 trade unionists, and of these only about 50,000 were affiliated to the Irish Trade Union Congress. Employers accepted craft unions, but they were opposed to the unionisation of the unskilled. They said that the economy couldn't afford it. And in any case, there was a very important social difference between the craftsman and the labourer. The craftsman was seen as responsible and respectable. The labourer was regarded as too dangerous a person to entrust with a dangerous weapon like trade unionism. So the problem in Ireland was that the craft unions were not really strong enough to act as a leading sector for labour. And that was kind of exacerbated by the fact that Belfast was the main centre of craft unionism, and most of the craft unions in Belfast They had very little really to do with the rest of Ireland, even with the rest of Belfast. In some ways, there were two labour movements in Belfast, between the mid-19th and mid-19th century and 1914, because the craft unions in shipbuilding and engineering, they tended to be conservative in politics, and they kept themselves very much to themselves. It was the other unions, then the weaker unions, who were affiliated to Belfast Trades Council. But the employers had an Achilles heel in transport. This was an important growth area. And it was an area which is well placed for militancy, because if you went on strike in a factory, it could be months before the strike had any impact commercially. But if the railway stopped or shipping, it had an immediate impact. Or even a dock strike could leave perishable goods on the quayside. So transport would be the leading sector of trade union unrest, and it's no coincidence that it was so important in the 1907 strike in Belfast and the 1913 strike or lockout in Dublin. Now let me look at these three leaders of Labour and the kind of politics that they put forward. First of all, William Walker. Here we see a picture of depiction of Walker when this dates from 1911, when he contested the Edinburgh constituency of Leith boroughs just outside Edinburgh as a Labour candidate. We tend to think of Labour in Belfast, as being affected by the sectarian divide, and Belfast, of course, had become notorious for sectarianism by the end of the 19th century. It was seen as a very tolerant, liberal place at the start of the 19th century, but by the end, it had experienced quite a lot of sectarian violence. But this wasn't the big problem for political Labour, because Catholics were fairly marginal in the trade union movement and on the Trades Council. So the key contradiction was the difference between Labour with a capital L, that's to say the organisers, the union officials, the activists, and Labour with a small L, employees, workers. Labour with a capital L tended to look to the British Labour movement as its role model. And of course, British Labour supported the Liberal Party in the 19th century at any rate. And then after 1900, it formed the Labour Party and started to move towards Labour. And the Liberals and Labour tended to be pro-Home Rule. The massive workers in Belfast, on the other hand, were conservative and unionist. And that really was the fundamental political problem facing Labour. William Walker tried to get over this by arguing that workers throughout Ireland, and he insisted on that point. His message was not just for Belfast, but it was for all of Ireland, should support the British Labour Party. After its foundation in 1900, Walker was very keen to be in the British Labour Party, preferably as an MP, of course. And he persuaded Belfast Trades Council to affiliate to the party in 1903. From the time of the first Home Rule crisis, the Trades Council had adopted a kind of local labourism. They distanced themselves a bit from the British TUC and bodies like the Labour Electoral Association or the Labour Electoral Committee set up by the TUC, because these were Lib Lab or Liberal Labour, and Lib Labism was the kind of natural politics of trade unionists at the time, but that in turn connected them with a pro-Home Rule position. So Belfast Trades Council wanted to sort of stand back from that. And what it did was to try and, in effect, form its own local Labour Party and maintain its distinction from other political parties. But this was difficult. It was expensive. It led to disciplinary problems, and joining British Labour seemed to be a more attractive position, particularly now that workers in Britain were beginning to move to the British Labour Party. And Home Rule was off the agenda because the Tories were in power, and it seemed a fairly distant prospect in 1903. So Walker argued that this was the way to resolve the problems of division in Ireland. Get all the trade unions, all the trade unionists behind the British Labour Party. He said it doesn't matter where Ireland is governed from. What matters is that it's good government. and that only Labour really could provide good government. So he was able to persuade the Trades Council to affiliate to the party, and he contested 3 by-elections at the time in 1905, or three elections in Belfast North. The North was seen as the most Labour part of the city at that time. The South was the more middle-class area, although it had elected this working-class loyalist MP, Todd Sloan, who beat the official Unionist candidate in 1902. The East was seen as solidly Unionist. The West was just about being taken over by the Nationalists, and Joe Devlin would be elected as MP for West Belfast, or Belfast West, in 1906. But the North was the most recently built part of Belfast, seen as the most integrated and the most left-wing. So in 1905, there was a by-election there, and the Unionists nominated a weak candidate in Sir Daniel Dixon, Dodger Dan, as Walker liked to call him, who was rumoured to be corrupt, headed for the divorce courts, which is a great scandal at the time, and, worse still, not an Orangeman. So it looked as if Walker had a good chance of beating him, and Walker's election agent in the campaign was Ramsay MacDonald, who became the first Labour Prime Minister subsequently. But unfortunately, Walker's campaign would be remembered for a compromise he made with Todd Sloan's loyalist group, the Belfast Protestant Association, and that kind of tarnished his reputation, and arguably it lost him the Catholic vote in the constituency, and possibly lost him the seat. He came closer to winning North Belfast in 1906, but 1906 was famous for the big landslide victory of the Liberals, and with the Liberals back in power, Home Rule is now back in the realm of possibility, although it wasn't on the government's programme. But nonetheless, people in Belfast started to get nervous about it again. So support for Labour began to drain away really after 1906, and Walker realised that he wasn't going to get elected in Belfast, which is one reason why he started looking for a seat in Britain, and he eventually got a nomination, as you can see there, in 1911 for Leith Burroughs. Here's another picture of Walker. He was remembered as a sort of hero of the Labour movement, and he was an official of the Carpenters and Joiners Society, very important craft union at the time. And here you can see a meeting where they're unveiling a union banner in the Independent Labour Hall in York Street, and these very nice, neatly turned out, respectable craftsmen are paying tribute to Brother Walker. He always wore that high white collar. He was kind of famous for that. Turn to Larkin. 1907 was a remarkable year for Belfast Labour. The British Labour Party held its annual conference here in January. Then Walker fought another campaign in North Belfast. But in the summer then you had the big strike. And John Gray has written a wonderful account of this strike and of Larkin's time in Belfast, so I won't go into any detail here. But simply to note that Larkinism began in Belfast, and Larkin was sent to Ireland to reorganise the ports for the National Union of Dock Labourers, Liverpool-based union, known in Britain as the Irish Union because there were so many Irish in it at all levels. But the defeat in Belfast led him to move south, and he moved to Dublin, ran into more problems with his General Secretary, James Sexton, and eventually then founded, towards the end of 1908, start of 1909, he founded his own union, the Irish Transport and General Workers Union. And this would revolutionise Labour, because once Larkin founded an Irish union, everything follows from that. He started to argue for Irish-based unionism. As an agent of the National Union of Dock Labourers, he'd argued against the formation of Irish unions. He said, nationalism shouldn't be imported into the trade union movement. But now that he formed an Irish union, nationalism was water to the mill. And we have this image of Larkin, I think, thanks maybe to people like Sean O'Casey, as an internationalist rather than a nationalist. But Larkin was in many ways much more nationalist than Connolly. And I think it was really Larkin who made republicanism a force within the labour movement. And he argued very strongly for the development of a completely separate Irish labour movement, completely separate from Britain. Larkin was also a syndicalist, and this was a version of Marxism which was very, very popular at this time. It was really the leading version of revolutionism before the Bolshevik Revolution. The syndicalists argue that the revolution hadn't happened. I mean, after all, Marx expected it in his own day. He expected it in 1848. So by the 1880s, people were asking, why is capitalism still able to survive? And one of the reasons they came up with was that the political parties had got too hidebound. They'd become dominated by middle-class elites and by intellectuals, and they'd lost contact with the working class. So to rejuvenate the struggle, you needed to get back to the point of production where the worker was most powerful and base a new form of struggle around the industrial power of the worker. And this idea became increasingly popular throughout the industrial world, and it began to take off in Britain around about 1909, 1910, led by people like Tom Mann. Larkin was very much influenced by it. So too was Connolly in the United States. So by 1910, Larkin was arguing that the Irish Transport and General Workers Union should be an industrial union, in effect a syndicalist union. And this is probably the more famous picture of Larkin. It's kind of associated, I think, with the 1913 lockout, but it's actually taken in 1923 when he came back from the United States. But there was a lot going on. I mean, there's no time to go into any great detail on what was happening, but just to note that this was an incredibly active period of labour history. The foundation of the Irish Transport and General Workers Union in 1909. Larkin then founded the Irish Worker, his extremely successful newspaper, in 1911. That period from 1911 to 1913 is remembered in British labour history as the Great Labour Unrest. And in many ways, the Irish strikes, there were big strikes in 1911, as well as the big one in 1913. They were part of that Great Labour Unrest. But after 1916, there was a second strike wave, which has largely been forgotten about, which is even bigger and more radical again. And Labour went through this extraordinary phase of militancy and radicalism between 1917 and 1923. And it was eventually crushed by the slump. The war had led to an economic boom. After the war, people wanted to buy all the things they couldn't buy during the war. But there was a crisis of overproduction beginning about August of 1920. 1920 was kind of like 2008. Everything was looking grand in the spring, and then it started to go pear-shaped by the autumn. And by the end of the year, in the spring, the unions are looking for wage increases. By the end of the year, the employers are looking for wage cuts. So things just really got bad. I mean, by 1921, you had 25% unemployment, major attack on trade unions, and the whole spirit of militancy was absolutely crushed by 1923. It was also an important time in labour history. Connolly's book, probably the most famous book on Irish labour history, his Labour in Irish History, came out in 1910. He'd been writing it from about the 1890s. It was finally published in 1910. Obviously, Connolly didn't have to worry about the RAE and the RAF and all that kind of stuff. But there were two contemporary histories. This is really quite remarkable. Immediately after the 1913 lockout, the employers, they must have known, I suppose, that they would be seen as the bad guys. And they commissioned an English journalist, Arnold Wright, to write a history of the lockout, which was published in 1914. And then the Citizen Army commissioned Sean O'Casey to write a history of the Citizen Army, which had only been founded in 1913. Then you had the first general history of labour by W.P. Ryan, he had been a journalist in Ireland, and then he became deputy editor of the Daily Herald, the labour newspaper, which changed its name in 1962 to The Sun. believe it or not, and went on to other things. And then you had an academic history of labour, or this is a study of labour. It's not really a history, it's more a kind of study of labour, a generic study of labour organisation. But it's from an academic, George O'Brien. Another book on labour from an Irish-based academic wouldn't appear until 1977. And as well as that, there were numerous pamphlets and all sorts of labour newspapers were appearing. And I cited Liam O'Flaherty's novel, The Informer, there, published in 1925, because it's emblematic of what happened to labour, to this remarkable upsurge of militancy at this time. O'Flaherty had been in the Communist Party, and he based The Informer on the Communist Party. The Informer, Jip O'Nolan, is sent to what looks like a big farm strike in Waterford in 1923 to shoot a farmer. And then he sort of turns renegade, and he's on the run from the revolutionary organisation, as it's called, which is really the Communist Party of Ireland. And O'Flaherty kind of took his revenge on Roddy Connolly, James Connolly's son, who was leader of the revolutionary, or he was leader of the Communist Party. But in the novel, there's a guy called Dan Gallagher, Commandant Dan Gallagher, who bears a suspicious resemblance to Roddy Connolly and is invested with a lot of the vices of Roddy Connolly as far as Liam O'Flaherty was concerned. But when John Ford made his famous Oscar-winning film on The Informer, he turned The Informer into a man on the run from the IRA, and that's how people remember it. You know, the idea of The Informer being based on the Communist Party, the idea of a big farm strike, the Communist Party, all that kind of thing, happening during the War of Independence just seems kind of bizarre to most people subsequently. So all of this was kind of airbrushed out of public history. So moving back to labour history and politics. Labour politics in Belfast virtually collapsed during the Third Home Rule crisis. It had been on decline since the Liberals got back into power in 1906. And James Connolly has been blamed for this because Connolly moved to Belfast in 1911. He was appointed as an organiser for the ITGW. And he soon, argued for the Trades Council taking a Republican position. He's quite uncompromising on that. But to my mind, I think this is a distortion of reality. I don't think Connolly was so influential on the Trades Council. It seems to me that by 1911, there were probably about 3 groups on the eve of the Home Rule crisis. There were about 3 groups left, 3 political groups on the Trades Council. Connolly did rally a group of Republicans around him on one side. On the other side, you had a group of Walkerites. On the other side, you had people who were conservative in politics and believed that Labour should have nothing to do with the national question and I'd probably have preferred partition to Home Rule. But then in the middle, you had this group of Walkerites, a sort of fraying band of middle-of-the-roaders who were postponing taking a position on the national question until the last minute. But when it came to the crunch, their position was anti-partitionist. And they were against partition because they believed that it would lock them into an orange state. And, it has been argued that Connolly, converted people to this point of view and that this alienated the mass of workers from Belfast Trades Council. But I just don't see that argument stands up at all. If you read what Ramsay MacDonald was saying in Parliament during the Third Home Rule crisis, it's pretty much the same as what Connolly was saying. After the Curragh Mutiny in 1914, Ramsay MacDonald told the House of Commons, pass Home Rule as quickly as possible and take the consequences. The Labour position was that you just couldn't support the Unionists because, first of all, they were hand in glove with the Tories, and secondly, because unionism was based on a sectarian mobilisation. And the whole thrust of Labour politics was to get religion out of politics. We remember, Connolly's remark that partition would lead to a carnival of reaction, but that was exceptional only in its eloquence. They all took that line. So he was really quite representative, I think, of the mass of workers, of the mass of Labour activists. But the radicalisation in the later war years, 1917, 1918, led to a revival of Labour politics. And in April of 1918, the local left formed the Belfast Labour Party. The party was probably Walkerite at heart in that they affiliated, or they tried to affiliate to the British Labour Party. They were told, well, look, now there's an Irish Labour Party in being since 1912, on paper at least, and you should join the Irish Labour Party. They weren't too happy with that, and they formed the Belfast Labour Party. So they were clearly not very comfortable with any kind of nationalism and probably really didn't want home rule, but they certainly didn't want partition either. And 3 of the party's 4 candidates in the 1918 general election were actually home rulers. There were people who had come to the conclusion that home rule was inevitable in some form, so it was really better to go along with it because the alternative was partition. So you had a variety of views, but I think the predominant view on Belfast Trades Council by 1918, 1919, 1920 would have been to accept home rule reluctantly rather than embrace partition. And there was a lot of support for Labour at this time, and Labour did fairly well in the 1920 elections. This would have been the high watermark of Labour. You can see the outgoing corporation, 52 unionists, 8 nationalists. The incoming one, 37 unionists, including 6 Labour unionists. Sir Edward Carson had founded the Ulster Unionist Labour Association in 1918. I mean, all of the parties, the 3 main parties, the Redmondites, the Unionists, Sinn Féin, they were all worried about Labour. They were all trying to court support from Labour. Joe Devlin, he was John Redmond's spokesman on Labour affairs, and he proposed this new democratic movement committed to co-partnership in industry and profit sharing. And Devlin promised that the parliamentary party would fight for better social legislation at Westminster. And he said Sinn Féin's policy of abstentionism amounted to saying Labour must wait for the dim and distant republic before there could be any improvement in social legislation. And that phrase got legs, and people actually believed that the Sinn Féin or De Valera had actually said Labour must wait. But they never did. In fact, what they wanted was they wanted an alliance with Labour in the 1918 elections. The Unionists were a bit different in that they were very hostile to the official Labour movement. So their strategy was to form their own Labour group, the Ulster Unionist Labour Association. And it had some importance at the time, and as you can see, 6 of their 37 councillors there were Labour Unionists. So the results of the 1918 and 1920 elections suggest that maybe about 20% of Belfast Protestants were against partition. I mean, it's hard to be precise on it, but that figure, I think, I don't think it's an exaggeration. But from there, it was all downhill for Belfast Labour. The 3 Home Rule crises had seen workers expelled from the shipyards, and the biggest round of expulsions began in July of 1920. Over 8,000 people were victimised, and at least 2,000 of these were Protestants. And they were victimised because they were Labour activists. And if you were a Labour activist, you were presumed to be pro-Home Rule. So, you take 2,000 activists out of a movement in a city the size of Belfast, and you're doing a hell of a lot of damage to that movement. Labour put forward 3 candidates in the first Northern Ireland Parliament elections in 1921, but such was the climate that they were unable to campaign openly. And then, of course, there was the slump. From August of 1920, the economy began to suffer the effects of the crisis of overproduction. And this was to have a particularly devastating effect on Northern Ireland, which is heavily based on manufacture. You had an unemployment rate of 25, 26% in the 1920s, and then in the 1930s, things got worse. So, in a way, the worst fears of Belfast labour came to pass in 1920-21, when the great promise of post-war radicalism gave way to reaction and division. The fear of partition was the one thing that united all labour rights in Ireland, though they had different reasons for fearing it and different ways of dealing with it. Finally, in conclusion, just a point about the commemorations, the decade of commemoration. In commemorating the labour strand in the decade of centenaries, it's important not to present labour as some kind of neutral option between unionism and nationalism. Certainly it was a third strand, but one with viewpoints on the other two. And as we've seen, there were many different labour positions on the national question. Walker was pro-union and anti-unionist. Others were anti-home rule and anti-partition, and then largely pro-home rule. And in the South, Labour was mainly Republican. Of course, it's important to recognise too that possibilities look very different before partition. Everything changed really when partition created a completely new context. Instead of partitions don't solve the question, but they change the question. And that certainly was the case in Northern Ireland. And when Belfast Labour reformed politically in 1924 as the Northern Ireland Labour Party, it was in a context which is shaped by the 1920-22 settlement. And that party would gradually move towards an acceptance of the status quo and come out in favour of the Northern Ireland Constitution in 1949. So thank you very much.